Hi everybody, this is Scott Kamshafer again, clinical social worker here in Austin, Texas, and I just wanted to talk today about the condition of isolation. And it is something that I have seen more often than not, and almost entirely across populations that I've served as a mental health provider in my 7 years of experience. It's something that is very typical to depression. It's also very typical to people who suffer from addictions, but it can be tied to any number of other mental health conditions. And it tends to be one of the hallmarks of our age, oddly enough, in a time where there's so much connectivity and there's so much interconnectedness through the internet and instant communication with other people. We would think that the walls of separation between us and other people would have crumbled down by now. And yet, what we're seeing with all of the electronic, instant 24 hours a day communication, that people are actually suffering from more isolation rather than less. In fact, depression is considered now by the World Health Organization to be the leading cause of disability and ineffectiveness, lack of functionality amongst individuals across the globe. So, not that it's not related to other conditions. And with that, depression can often go isolation, either as a cause or as a symptom. And so now, more than perhaps ever before, we find that people are feeling more isolated, more cut off, more disconnected from other people than ever before. So I wanted to take the time to just talk about how much of an issue it is, and also talk about some ways to overcome it. Because as much as it's a problem, there are myriad ways of overcoming it. And typically people come into my office complaining about isolation. And one of the ways that they overcome isolation is by talking about their stories and talking about their struggles with me or other clinicians who seek to help them out. And yet, over the long haul, their relationship with me is not meant to be the sole means of overcoming their isolation. Typically, we find that social groups, therapy groups, self-help groups of all types help to overcome this increasing trend towards isolation. I had one friend of mine once call it isolationism, which is it's a foreign policy, but it gets to the heart of how deeply ingrained isolation can be for some individuals, that it's so much a part of their lifestyle and their way of living that they've tended to identify with that. And yet that's not the way we were built. We are social beings. In fact, one recent survey identified that 70% of all laughter is experienced with groups. So we may want to watch a funny TV show, and yet that's not one of the main ways that people experience humor and levity. It's a social construct as much as anything else, and that helps to decrease stress levels. Likewise does any affiliation with a group where there's important degrees of bonding that are happening in terms of emotional interconnectedness and interpersonal vulnerability. You know, it's one thing to get with a group to gossip about somebody else. It's another thing to get with a group to self-disclose and to enrich my life and to find a way out of the isolation that's tended to keep me in this morass of depression or anxiety or whatever it is. So as much as this instant communication and this 24 hours a day interconnectedness electronically is a benefit to us, it also can be very confining, because if the only way I can interact with people is through electronic means, then I'm still essentially by myself. There may be ways to overcome that through the connections of the internet or FaceTime with a cell phone. However, there is still this fundamental need to have people somehow coming into my interpersonal sphere live and in person, because otherwise there's a degree of separation that doesn't give me the sense of security, the sense of belonging that I get by having people with me in terms of family, friends, larger communities. So I guess that's the main thing I wanted to get across, is that to the extent that you or someone you care about is suffering from isolation, that you would get help, or they would get help to help them overcome that. Because to the degree that they do get help, that they have a much greater chance of having mental health, of having overall personal happiness and contentment in their life. And to the extent that you or they don't have it, there's that potential for unpleasant or unhealthy mental health outcomes. So I encourage you and everyone you care about to do what you can to connect with other people interpersonally, and to not suffer in isolation any longer than you can. One other point has to do with how loneliness is typically one of the hallmarks of two stages of life, adolescence and older adulthood. And on the one hand, adolescents tend to have a lesser tolerance for isolation, or for loneliness, I should say, whereas older adults tend to accept that more readily. But that is not something that is conducive to well-being. You know, it's one thing to accept something that I can't do anything about. It's another thing to understand that this is something that I suffer from, but it's also something that I need to work to overcome. So especially if you're an older adult or an adolescent and you find yourself in the grips of loneliness, understand that connecting with other people is the prime way of doing that. And whatever means it takes for you to get the help you need to break out of isolation, I totally support you in making that leap. And if there's anything I can do on my end in terms of psychotherapy or working with you to help encourage you to overcome your isolation, please contact me at the number that is on my website, because I'd be happy to help you in working towards increasing your sense of connectedness and bondedness with other people. That's the way to mental health. That's the way out of emotional suffering. So I just wanted to thank you for watching this little video blog, and I wish you well in your journey in life and just in general. So thanks again.